Good afternoon. As Lynn said, my name is Kerry Murray. I'm with the Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor. Originally, our president was supposed to be standing in front of you, but she's currently involved in other activities, so hence, you get me. I guess first I'd like to acknowledge and thank Wade and Doug and Scott for bringing such diverse voices around the table. It's extremely important to have these discussions, as tough as they can be sometimes, and certainly reflective of some of the economic and social challenges that we currently face. There's no downside to having the discussion, and in fact, we have a strong history, or a history, of social dialogue here in the province, where we use that and put a lot of diverse voices around the table to kind of hash out some major economic and social issues that we had. Our presentation is around, is it a revenue problem, an expenditure problem, or is it a combination of both? We've seen from some of the presentations today, it's a lot of different perspectives on a lot of the issues that we face. So, okay, hopefully this will work. So I'm basically going to look at, discuss or put some points out around, is it revenue, is it expenditure, and some of the things that we can possibly do. But first, just a bit of clarification around the deficit. I know you hear in a lot of conversations from that, you know, people don't understand the deficit, or people don't think we have a deficit here in this province. And I think Newfoundlanders and Labradorians do understand that we have a deficit, and that it's quite serious, and that it has to be addressed. I think from our perspective, we think that that can be done, well, we know it can be done without hurting the most vulnerable residents that are amongst us. It doesn't have to increase the depth or the breadth or the seriousness of the unemployment crisis, which I know Kathy said population is, you know, our major crisis, and I'm saying unemployment is our major crisis, which, you know, speaks to the how serious the issues are, and we don't have to jeopardize our economy going forward. So, what I'll look at, the dominant narrative, which it permeates a lot of discussions around our economic challenges. What's the simple answer to that? And what we think is an evidence-based answer to kind of look at some of the different options of how we can move our economy forward, both economically, socially, and environmentally. So the dominant narrative today, and it's a spending problem. We hear it in the media, it gets repeated quite a bit, but because we hear it a lot, doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, that it is only a spending problem, or that austerity or some mix of austerity measures such as cutting public services or cutting certain programs is the only answer, or is the only way forward for our economy. I don't believe that's true. And hopefully you'll see some examples of different options that would show that that's probably not the only answer. So the OECD, amongst other, you know, global think tanks, as they might be called, you know, are warning against moving to austerity. Austerity tends to be framed as you know, it's a policy that was used by a lot of you know, national jurisdictions in the 70s to rein in economic activity or that sort of thing. You know, that mainstream economic thinking and probably the most current economic research probably shows that that's not the optimal solution. We think the pandemic presents us a great opportunity to rebuild, refocus, and realign economic and social programs and policies, you know, to put us on a better footing that will ensure inclusive, sustained growth, give everyone an equal opportunity to participate in the economy. And probably an issue that's come to the forefront is environmental stewardship. How do we address climate change, especially in our province, you know, where we depend on fossil fuels and other resources? So I'm just going to put some that around the spending issue, that there are some myths out there that probably can be dispelled. So, for instance, salaries that increased too fast when oil and gas or oil money came into the province. And this chart will show this is from earnings from 2001 to 2019, goods producing sector, the service producing industries, all of them. The ones in red are educational services and health and social assistance, which over that period of time, which is 18 to 19 years, increased around 160%, which is that's over 20 years, which is quite a bit less than the other sectors. Are wages too high for frontline workers? This will compare Newfoundland and Labrador within Atlantic Canada. Minimum, maximum salaries for just acute care nursing. This data comes from the Canadian Federation of Nurses Union, and it's all StatsCan data. So if you look at Newfoundland, the minimum salary compared to PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, we're kind of in the middle. We're lower than 2. We're on par with New Brunswick. And in maximum salaries, we would be on par with New Brunswick. We're not the highest, we're not the lowest, but they're not exorbitant. Let's look at LPNs, licensed practical nurses here in the province. Minimum, maximum. Again, this is StatsCan data, which shows Newfoundland minimum and compared to the other Atlantic provinces at a maximum. Again, we're not the highest. And again, teachers, and these are all public sector workers, Newfoundland, so this would be category 5, which would be the equivalent of a bachelor's degree in the teaching system. On a minimum, we're on par with all the other Atlantic provinces, and we would be at the maximum, we would be at the lowest. So spending is, I guess, is relative, and to say that we would have the highest wages or salaries amongst public servants is probably not entirely accurate. The number of public sector employees as a percentage of GDP, which is relative to the size of your economy, which I think most presenters here have used GDP as the indicator around economic activity. Bear in mind, we don't tax people, we tax activity, economic activity. So can the size of the Newfoundland economy support the current number? So as a percentage of our economy, we would have the lowest, the smallest public sector, as opposed to numbers that could get put out there, absolute numbers, let's say. And we have the lowest number relative to our GDP in all of Atlantic Canada. And you'll hear different arguments about why and how that works, but we're a small population. We're spread over a very large geography. People depend on public services in all communities and rural communities. And I mean, for us at the Federation of Labor, we represent workers that live in every community in this province, work in every sector, and you know, we've had discussions around all this to, you know, get their input. And so how we allocate public services and public service workers or public sector workers is very important to the sustainability of rural communities especially. Oh, sorry. And this is program spending, so the issue comes up around spending again. Our program spending as a percentage of our economy or as a percentage of GDP, again, is low compared to the other Atlantic provinces, with PEI being the highest. The other spending myth that I just want to highlight is a lot of people say our spending is out of control. And I think since the oil crash of 2014, Newfoundland and Labrador has had the lowest increase in spending out of all Atlantic Canadian provinces. And the list here on the right of this chart is the order of increase for spending, public program spending in all provinces. So and I know the answer, the simple answer to our issues tends to be spending. We have to cut spending, or we have to reduce spending. You know, and I think that that shows that we're not spending. Our spending is an issue, and we have to address it. But I think there are other solutions that we can look at. So if we look at oil, I mean, oil was very important to our economy. It allowed us to do a huge number of things, the poverty reduction strategy, which was mentioned, infrastructure. We had a huge infrastructure deficit in our province for, you know, many, many years. A lot of people talk about that we could have made investments in a wealth fund. I mean, that would probably have been at the expense of addressing that infrastructure deficit and social deficit, that sort of thing. Norway, for instance, has a fairly huge pension fund. And I know the current government is looking at a wealth fund going forward. And I think those are great ideas, but I don't, you know, the golden age of fossil fuel may be on the decline. And where did the money go during, you know, a lot of that period? We gave out some significant tax cuts starting probably around 2004. They benefited high-income earners mostly. Those tax cuts, cumulative up to last year, have probably cost the government treasury in excess of $4 billion. The big ones that were done in the 2010, 2012 cost about $600 million a year. I think and this is a quote from a previous budget in 2016. The previous administration provided large tax reductions that were not sustainable over time. I mean, if we had our taxes where they existed in that period of time today, I mean, that would make a significant difference, I think, to the provincial economy. So I guess the underlying point here is those deficits, cumulative deficits, create debt. And I know there's many components to debt, but maybe that's a needless one that we probably wouldn't be dealing with today and wouldn't be facing some of the challenges, and some of us probably wouldn't be sat in this room today. So I guess that brings me to the point of what are some of the things that we can do? And you know, being rational and calm is one thing. And don't make hasty decisions. There are a lot of voices that are around the table calling for, you know, different actions or different things that governments can do or should do or must do. I think these things have to be thought out. Top-down, I think as someone said, top-down austerity is really not, you know, the answer. Do things that generate economic growth. As I said before, economic activity is what we tax, not people. And selectively raise revenues. I think Trevor spoke in his presentation that we have modest room for revenue growth. You know, from the could be high-income earners to corporations and pollution are areas that can be taxed. I know tax is not a very popular word. I can see some people grimace, but it's the reality of the situation. So, do we have room to raise revenues? Our revenue in Newfoundland and Labrador as a percentage of our economy is fairly low and has been declining over time, as you can see on the top chart from the 80s to the current decade. If we boosted our revenues to just the Atlantic Canada average, if you look at revenue growth or revenue generation in different provinces across the country, we're not at the top. We're not at the bottom, but we're not far. So we have, on the bottom it shows Newfoundland and the other 3 Atlantic provinces as a percent, what our revenues are as a percentage of GDP. If we boosted our provincial revenues to just the Atlantic Canadian average, that would yield approximately $1 billion. For instance, even on, I know we just raised the personal income tax rate on the top brackets, but in Nova Scotia, if you make, for instance, just an example, they're taxed at 21%, if you earn over 150,000. In Newfoundland and Labrador, if you earn 190,000, you're taxed at around 18%. So whoever has the lowest taxes doesn't win. And I think that's been proven over time. So these are, did I go ahead? Sorry. So these are just some suggested options that we could look at around revenue growth. The very first one on the left, job creation. If we reduce our unemployment by 3%, that increases tax revenue. Raising the personal income tax rate on the top two brackets by 2%, which would bring us into the Atlantic Canadian average, could raise approximately $40 million. A wealth tax, that's a discussion that's permeating the entire planet, especially in countries that have huge inequality and have a lot of wealth. How do we tax that? Capital gains taxes should be taxed the same as wages. They're taxed at, I think, 50%. And on down the line, a carbon tax, best-in-class energy efficiency, and a luxury tax. So those changes to tax policy could generate over $800 million annually. And on the right-hand side, those are some other revenue sources that could be looked at as well. And we're not saying these are the ones that have to be done, but we're just trying, this is part of adding to the conversation. Here are options. I think most importantly around our province as we go forward, inequality, poverty, and the climate crisis are real things that are on the table right in front of us. And if we're going to, move forward as a province and build a more inclusive, place to live, I've been fortunate enough to work and live in this province most of my life. I think Mr. Williams mentioned valet. My son works with valet, so he gets to have a very good paying job with benefits here in the province, so he doesn't have to go away. And I'm sure lots of people here that have kids, they're not here, or they probably won't be here. So I think part of this type of forum is to put some other options out there, and these ones, tax cuts are not, in today's economic and social and environmental reality, are not the answer. So provincial revenues, this just shows the carbon tax. So as we move forward with the carbon tax, that's a significant source of revenue. And it's also a significant way to, I guess, rebate to people who are least able to pay that type of tax. And plus, there's an opportunity to increase that by including more greenhouse gas emitters. We currently have a lot of exemptions to the carbon tax here in the province. An example is every time there's a carbon tax comes in, we'll reduce the gas tax. Part of that should be to change behavior, and that's probably not the ideal way to do it. So these are by incorporating these revenues, these tax revenues and other actions, there are things that can be done as well that don't cost. They're just shifts in policy direction. So these are fair revenue and the PERT proposal, which I know is a top of mind issue with how we move forward. But if we look at changes to our tax system, we can basically make the same difference in the economy as the revenue options suggested by the provincial economic recovery process and the cuts. Some of the cuts recommended are not conducive to moving the economy forward, I don't think. And this chart here just shows the revenues and deficit projections moving forward. So the red bar, which shows a deficit, if nothing happened, if we keep going forward without doing anything, that's the deficit that we will incur. If we incorporate with the blue bar, the revenues that we've estimated, let's say, from some of the changes. The gold bar is the impact on the surplus, or the deficit, sorry. So by 2026, 27, we could be fairly free of a deficit. And these are not exact calculations, obviously. So I guess I'm probably the only speaker here today who hasn't had a quote. So I'll bring one in right now, which comes from William Kelly, a famous fisherman in Placentia Bay in Long Harbor, who happens to be my grandfather. There's more than one way to cook a fish. And I think that's an oversimplification, but it's part of what we need to get out of this type of discussion and dialogue. There's more than one way forward here. And there's ways that do no harm. And I think the lens that we probably need is that lens. Do no harm to people. Especially those that are have the least ability to absorb the impact of cuts and austerity measures and that sort of thing. So just to conclude, we get it. The deficit needs to be addressed. But, bringing in balanced budget legislation could be very harmful. For instance, if we had to have balanced budget legislation before the COVID pandemic, your hands are tied. So I think it's just not. I don't find it. It's just not good fiscal policy from our perspective. I don't think it's a myth that spending is spiraling out of control. The impact of tax cuts that we gave were just unsustainable. They really were unsustainable. And I think that is we're paying for that now, in spades. But I think the good news is, and we have room to increase revenues that can address the deficit and bring it down. And plus, we have a lot going for us in this province. We have a lot of natural resources, like a room full of very smart people here. And the people that are here are staying. They're not going. Like, we're not going anywhere. So we're here. We're kind of glued to the rock. So I think the whole issue around having different options to move forward is important. And I think that's it for me. I was probably fast.
Thank you for that. You did my job for me. You got us back on schedule. Excellent. So we can take some questions. So the floor is open, and we have. Let's start with an online question.
I have an easy one here to get you started from John Goswell. John's wondering how many people are employed in the NL public sector.
In the public sector, well, I don't even know if the public sector would know that. You have to look at core government, and you have to look at agencies, boards, and crowns. So I would be not the one to answer, but I think there's around 22 in core government. But I'm reluctant to answer because I don't know the entire amount right now.
Okay, we'll take one on the floor, and then we'll come back to our virtual. Let's start here.
I'd just like to pick up on one of your points, which was minimum wage at $15 an hour. What we have to acknowledge is, even at that level, it enforces many of the people who work in the retail trade to work below the poverty level. So we keep that salary artificially low so we can enjoy the benefits when we go to Walmart or Dominion or Sobeys. And trying to get it to $15, the objection is often, we can't afford it. I'm saying we cannot afford to keep a significant part of our population living in poverty. That's a greater problem than me having to pay a little bit more at the supermarket. Your reaction?
You're absolutely right. So we have about 30% of our labor force today that earn $15 an hour or less. a lot of those, they're not all students living home in their parents' basement. It's single parents, it's seniors, it's married couples with kids that both work a minimum wage job. By keeping the minimum wage low, it's just not good policy. And you mentioned Walmart. So Walmart pays $15 in Alberta. So does Tim Hortons. So do all those small businesses in retail that are traditionally low-wage employers, but it's not impacting their bottom line. And here we're really, for those large retail employers, we're subsidizing their bottom line by keeping our minimum wage low. And it's not more low-wage jobs that we need or precarious work. We need to create good jobs that have benefits, and good jobs that support communities and families. And I think that has to be the goal, and that's why for us, the unemployment crisis and the low minimum wage and all those things that suppress wages it's not good policy, and it'll hurt us, and it has hurt us and continues to hurt us in the long term. And just to finish, as when governments bring in policies like we want to increase our immigration target to 5,400, I think by 2025. These are people that you have to retain them when they know they can go not only to another province that has a better minimum wage, but there's probably a community of their culture that's bigger. It's more attractive. So those things like a fair minimum wage or a living wage, strong public services, access to education, all those things are important. And there's all these policies are horizontally connected and have to be, so you have to look at the impact. So what's a $12.50 minimum wage mean for immigration or poverty reduction or women's equality, all those things?
We'll take one here in the room, and then I think we have an online question after that. Could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Rob Strong, and I've been involved in the oil and gas business here in Newfoundland since '79. So I started as a child, but
We were in kindergarten.
I've had this burning question in my mind for a long, long time, and I appreciate the opportunity to ask it. And it relates to labor. And let me just present a scenario, and that is that if I have a valve company and I'm working out in Donovan's, and a company, let's take D.F. Burns, which is a fabrication company down on Logie Bay Road, and D.F. Burns calls me up and says, I need a valve which weighs 800 pounds. Can you order it in for me? And so I order on the valve company, I order it in from my supplier. It sits in my yard. I pick up the phone, I call D.F. Burns and say, hey, your valve is in now. And D.F. Burns said, well, can you deliver it to me tomorrow? And I said, yeah. So I call up Billard's Trucking as an example. So Billard's Trucking sends their truck out to Donovan's, and the guy gets out of the truck and he uses that little crane on the back of the truck, and he lifts the valve, the 800-pound valve in the back of the truck, and he ties it down. He drives down to the east end to D.F. Burns. He goes to the foreman. He says, where do you want it? And he says, when you put it over there. So he backs the truck over. He takes a little crane. He hooks it onto the strapping, and he lifts it off, takes off the wrapper, and passes the piece of paper to the guy at D.F. Burns and says, can you sign it? We've been hearing from the union movement for a long, long time is why we're not getting enough offshore-related work in Newfoundland. Well, take the same scenario at Bull Arm. There's a valve on one end of Bull Arm that has to be delivered to another end of Bull Arm. So guess what? The truck driver is a teamster. The guy that runs the crane is an operator. The guy, operating engineer. The guy that puts the strapping underneath is a rigger. The guy that strips off the wrapper is a laborer. You've got 4 people, and therefore you've got a 4-person. So you've got 5 people doing what 1 does. So my question is there some potential movement by the union, by the labor movement, to rationalize their activities so we can indeed attract more offshore-related work. Terra Nova is another example. We all know Terra Nova is going over to Spain the 2nd of December, and there is a concern being expressed by Trades NL that work will happen in Spain that should happen in Bull Arm. But we can't afford to have 5 people do what one person does, and that's what happened at Hibernia. I don't want to see it happen anymore because we're not going to get the jobs for Newfoundland, and that's what we're talking about today. It's about jobs and employment in Newfoundland. Care to comment?
How much did that valve weigh?
800 pounds.
Well, I mean, that's a question better posed to Trades NL, and obviously, Rob, I know you've got great experience and knowledge in that sector, but they negotiate those agreements with an employer group and Trades NL. I think it's the Resource Development Council, and
I mean, I don't mean to be a union basher, but if we're going to attract employment and good, high-paying jobs in Newfoundland, we have to be a little more reasonable from the union perspective.
Yeah, and I think, well, I think that that goes both ways. And I can't speak. I've never even set foot in Bull Arm. I've seen it from Sunnyside, the mountain there in Center Mountain. I mean,
Well, right now it's a graveyard, but
yeah, that's a negotiation. That's a process for negotiation between when you go to the table, the employers will know the issues, the unions will know the issues, and it's incumbent on both of them to craft an agreement that's fair to the workers, fair to the employer, and is fair to the economy and allows us to develop that industry or that sort of thing.
but having 5
Okay.
people
Can we?
do the one job, that's not fair to the project,
I'd like-
and it's not fair
Sorry.
to the province.
Sorry
Thank
to
you.
interrupt. I'd like to just get to the next question if we could. Did you want to say another word on that, Kerry, or should we
No,
move
that's
on?
good. That's
Okay. We've got one
That's a big
online.
valve.
We've got one online, and then we'll have to move on.
Yeah, we have. I have 2 that came in the same time. They're kind of similar, so I'll read both for you, Kerry, so you can kind of summarize. One from Gabriela Sebo, who is wondering why is the participation rate in the province at 56.6%, the lowest in Canada, and what can be done to increase it? And then our second from Beth Ryan. Beth is wondering, or saying, thanks for busting some of those prevailing myths about spending. The Dame Green report is emphatic that we have to reduce spending through cutting programs, such as in healthcare. What is the Federation of Labour's reaction to the Green report, and what would be your message to Premier Fury as government analyses that report?
Good one to end on, isn't it?
Yeah. I'll take the last question first. I'm not the one to comment on the Green report, but it is a process. I think it could have been more open, transparent, and with more accountability. But I mean, it's a report of recommendations. We don't necessarily agree with it. I'm sure other people don't agree with some of it, agree with some of it, agree with most of it. I think that I compared that because I was part of the health accord consultation as well. I know Dr. Parfrey's here, and I thought that the health accord process for engagement and consultation is a model that the province should use. It's the opposite of what was used for the PERT process. So, I think that's just something. I mean, it's a process, and it'll move forward. But I think openness and accountability are critical in public policy and how we develop it and how we craft it and how we implement it and how we use it to build the economy. On the participation rate, yeah, we have a low participation rate. Some of that is due to the seasonality of our economy. We have a huge seasonal component to our workforce, but seasonal industries support full-time industries. The fishery is a huge piece of the sustainability of rural Newfoundland and Labrador. And also we don't have the supports that are necessary for marginalized groups sometimes to participate in the labor force at the same level that you or I would. We're only just getting childcare. We have the lowest rate of participation in our labor force amongst women in the country. We have the lowest participation rate overall. Our participation rate is not trending in the same direction as the rest of the country. So those are issues that can be addressed without raising taxes or spending a lot of money. Those are policy. We should have better labor standards. We should have a higher minimum wage. We should have had $10 a day childcare a long time ago. But here we are. So it's not when you have an aging population, when you have an old population, when you have a highly dispersed population, it doesn't mean that last one out, turn off the lights. It just means that we do things differently. We need different social policy, stronger social policy. We need better economic policies. We need more progressive tax policy that supports our economy and things we want to do. So,
Thank you. Thanks for that.
Good.
Kerry?
okay, thank you. Oh, my mask.